teen eaten by wolves returns with a terrifying message from beyond. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a simple trip to the mountains with a few friends, a brief escape from the stress of school and life. But it turned into something far darker, far more twisted. Tyler had always been the adventurous type, the one who sought thrills and challenges, always looking for the next adrenaline rush. The wilderness was the perfect playground, with its untamed forests and rugged terrain. They had hiked the trails before, but this time, something was different. The air was colder than usual, the skies clouded with an ominous haze that hung thick over the mountainside. They had been too deep into the forest to turn back when it happened. The wolves. The first attack had come without warning, a blur of motion, teeth, claws, and blood, like the forest itself had come alive with rage. Tyler hadn't even seen the pack approach. One moment, he was walking with his friends, the next, he was being dragged to the ground, surrounded by the snarling creatures, their yellow eyes glowing with hunger. It all happened so fast, his screams lost in the chorus of the pack's howls. Tyler had fought back, of course. He had kicked, punched, tried to scramble away, but the wolves were relentless. They tore at his flesh with terrifying precision, each bite sending waves of searing pain through his body. The world became a blur of blood, terror, and the overwhelming scent of earth and death. By the time his friends had managed to scare the wolves off, it was too late. Tyler was covered in blood, his body a mangled mess, his skin shredded beyond recognition. The last thing he remembered before everything went black was his friends screaming for help, their faces contorted in horror and disbelief. He hadn't expected to wake up. Not like this. Not here. The first thing Tyler felt when he regained consciousness was the cold. It wasn't the cold of the mountain air, but the deep, unnatural cold that settled into his bones, into the very core of his being. It was as if the world had shifted, as if reality itself had folded into something darker, more grotesque. He opened his eyes to find himself in a place he didn't recognize, a desolate, twisted landscape. The ground was cracked and barren, the sky above him a sickly shade of gray. Shadows danced unnaturally in the distance, their shapes shifting like they were alive, watching him. Tyler tried to move, but his body felt foreign to him. His limbs were heavy, like they didn't belong to him anymore. He reached for his chest, his throat, his face, anything to feel some semblance of life, but all he could feel was the emptiness, the hollow sensation that had consumed him. That's when he saw them. The wolves. They were no longer the wild creatures that had torn at him in the forest. No, now they were something far worse, something far darker. Their eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light, and their teeth gleamed like knives in the dim light of the twisted world around him. They were standing in the distance, watching him with a calm intensity, their gazes unblinking, unfeeling. Tyler couldn't understand it. Was this death? Was this the afterlife? It didn't make sense. He had been torn apart, ripped to pieces. And yet, here he was whole but not, alive but not. The air around him crackled with an energy he couldn't explain, an energy that felt like it was pushing him toward something. Toward the wolves. Toward the truth. He stood up shakily, the weight of his own body dragging him down. He wasn't sure where he was going or why he was moving, but the wolves, they were calling to him, their eyes burning into his soul. Tyler took a step forward, then another, until the world around him began to distort, the ground beneath him warping as though it were made of liquid. He didn't want to go. He couldn't. But something inside of him told him that he had to know what was happening. He had to understand why he had been brought here, why his life had ended this way. He couldn't remember much, only flashes, screams, blood, teeth, and then nothing. The wolves were closer now, their eyes never leaving him. The air grew thicker, and Tyler felt the temperature drop. The cold wasn't just physical, it was in his mind, in his chest, like a weight he couldn't shake off. The wolves' growls filled the air, low and guttural, as if they were speaking to him, communicating something he couldn't understand. And then he saw it. A figure, standing in the shadows, partially obscured by the fog. A man. No, something else. The figure stepped forward, its face hidden beneath a hood, but Tyler could feel its presence, feel the weight of it pressing against him. It was something ancient, something powerful, something alive, but also not. "You're not supposed to be here, boy." The voice was deep, raspy, like it had come from the bottom of the earth itself. It sent a chill down Tyler's spine. What do you mean?" Tyler's voice was barely a whisper, hoarse, like he hadn't spoken in years. He tried to move, but his body refused to obey. It felt as if he were locked in place, his every muscle frozen with fear. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming. The wolves followed, closing in around him, their glowing eyes still fixed on him. "You were taken, boy. But you shouldn't have come back." The figure's voice was laden with a warning, its tone final. "You've seen too much. The wolves didn't just kill you, they marked you. And now, there's no escaping what comes next." Tyler's heart skipped a beat. Marked? What did that mean? He had been torn apart, ripped from the world. But now, in this place, in this strange, distorted world, the wolves had returned. They had found him. They had marked him for something worse than death. The figure laughed, the sound low and menacing, filling the air around him. "You think you escaped? Good. You are part of their pack now. You belong to them." The wolves' eyes glowed brighter, their growls growing louder as the figure's presence intensified. And Tyler realized, too late, that this wasn't just death. It was something worse. The wolves had not killed him. They had claimed him. And now, he would never be free. Tyler's mind raced as the figure's words sank in, each syllable heavy with an ominous weight that threatened to suffocate him. He was part of their pack now. The wolves. The same wolves that had torn him apart and left him for dead in the cold wilderness. They had claimed him. And now, in this strange, warped afterlife, there was no escape. There was no running from the horror that had been stitched into his soul. His heart pounded in his chest as the wolves closed in, their glowing eyes burning through the thick fog that seemed to swirl around him. They circled him, their growls low and guttural, sending waves of fear crashing through his body. Tyler's breath came in short, frantic gasps as he tried to back away, but his legs felt like they were made of stone. Every part of him was frozen, immobilized by the overwhelming sense of dread that gripped him. The figure, cloaked in shadow, stood behind him, watching silently as the wolves continued their eerie patrol, their teeth gleaming with hunger and malice. Tyler's mind was in overdrive, trying to make sense of what was happening, trying to piece together some semblance of understanding in the chaos that surrounded him. He had been dead, he had died, torn apart by the wolves. But now, here he was, in some twisted version of reality, caught between life and death, unable to move, unable to escape. "What do you want from me?" Tyler finally managed to force the words out, his voice shaking as he turned to face the figure. His body trembled with a mix of fear and confusion, the weight of everything pressing down on him like a crushing force. "What did you mean? Marked? What does that even mean?" The figure's laugh was soft, almost a whisper, but it reverberated through the air, sending chills down Tyler's spine. There was no warmth here, no safety. Everything about this place screamed of wrongness, of something unnatural and sinister that had latched onto him. Something that was never going to let go. "The wolves marked you, boy." The figure's voice was cold, devoid of empathy. "They don't just kill. They claim. And once you're claimed, there's no going back." Tyler's pulse quickened as the figure's words dug into him like an icy knife. He had never believed in the supernatural, never imagined that something like this, whatever this was, could exist. The fire, the screams, the endless darkness. It felt like a nightmare. But it wasn't a nightmare. It was real. Too real. "But I'm not one of them." Tyler tried to shout, but the words faltered in his throat, his body shaking uncontrollably. "I'm not a wolf. I'm human." The figure tilted its head, as if amused by his denial. Its eyes, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light, bored into him with a predatory gaze. "You were human. You were once one of them. But not anymore." The figure's words were final, and its gaze never wavered. "Once you've been claimed by the wolves, your humanity fades away. You're no longer part of their world. You belong to something darker now. Something older." Tyler's head spun as the weight of the figure's words crushed him from all sides. He wasn't sure what was worse, the fact that he was trapped in this place, surrounded by the terrifying wolves, or the realization that everything he had once been had been erased. His humanity was gone, replaced by something far more horrifying. He couldn't even tell what was left of him anymore. The fire that had consumed him in the woods, the pain that had torn him apart, had left nothing behind but an empty shell. A husk. "What do you mean?" Tyler whispered, his voice barely audible over the growling of the wolves. His body was trembling, not just from fear, but from something deeper, something primal. "What did they do to me?" The figure didn't answer immediately. Instead, it stepped forward, its shadow spreading across the ground like ink spilled in water, slowly, deliberately. Tyler's body reacted before his mind did, his feet moving without thought, attempting to back away, to flee from the dark figure that seemed to loom over him. "The wolves have chosen you for a reason, Tyler." The figure's voice cut through the fog like a blade, sharp and unyielding. "You are one of them now, whether you accept it or not. And when the time comes, you'll lead them." The words struck Tyler like a blow to the chest, knocking the breath out of him. He couldn't process it, couldn't understand. Led them? He had been torn apart, savaged by the wolves, and now, in some twisted afterlife, he was being told he would become one of them? Tyler shook his head, trying to deny it, but deep down, somewhere in the darkest corner of his mind, he knew it was true. The wolves hadn't just attacked him, they had marked him. They had torn him apart to claim him for something much worse. Something much older than he could fathom. He felt his body lurch as the wolves began to growl louder, their eyes glimmering like embers in the darkness. They circled him again, closing in, their steps deliberate, methodical. Tyler's heart raced as he realized they were drawing closer, surrounding him, trapping him in their insidious grip. "It's too late for you to escape, Tyler." The figure's voice was softer now, almost pitying. "You have already been chosen. The wolves are your family now. And when the time comes, you will lead them into the world of the living. Into the world where you once belonged." Tyler tried to back away, but the wolves were too close now. He could feel their hot breath on his skin, their teeth gleaming in the dim light. Their presence was suffocating, their eyes burning with an unholy hunger. It was like the very air around him had thickened, pressing in on him from all sides. There was no escape. The figure stepped back, fading into the darkness as the wolves advanced. Tyler was trapped, surrounded by the creatures that had once torn him apart and claimed his soul. His mind raced, but the truth of it all was undeniable. There was no hope. There was no escape. The wolves were getting closer, their snarls deafening in his ears, and Tyler's body trembled with an overwhelming sense of dread. He had already been claimed. He had already been marked. And now, there was no going back. There was no place for him in the world of the living anymore. As the wolves closed in, Tyler's breath hitched, his body trembling with an overwhelming fear. He had seen death, and now, he would see something far worse. Something that would follow him into the world of the living. But there was one thing he still didn't understand. Why had they chosen him? The wolves lunged forward. Tyler's breath caught in his throat as the wolves lunged forward. Their teeth gleamed in the dim light, their growls vibrating through the air like the growl of thunder before a storm. He could feel their eyes on him, cold and unyielding, and in that moment, he realized something chilling. They weren't just attacking him, they were waiting. Waiting for him to embrace what he had become. Waiting for him to understand that he was already one of them. His legs buckled under the pressure, his body shaking with a primal fear he couldn't control. He wanted to scream, to run, but it was as though his body had betrayed him. His limbs refused to move, locked in place by an invisible force. The wolves circled him, their steps synchronized, their movements deliberate. Each step they took was a reminder of what he had become, of the terrible truth that now consumed him. The figure, still watching from the shadows, spoke again, its voice slicing through the air with a cold edge. "They are your family now, Tyler." The voice was unyielding, and it echoed in his mind, drowning out everything else. "And when the time comes, you will lead them. You will lead them into the world you once knew." Tyler could feel the weight of the words pressing down on him, sinking into his chest like a sharp blade. He had no choice but to listen, to accept this horrible reality. But the more he tried to fight it, the more his body seemed to betray him. The wolves weren't just beasts of flesh and blood, they were something older, something more ancient than any living creature. They were the guardians of some terrible truth, and now he was a part of that truth. The ground beneath him began to rumble, the earth shaking as if it too was aware of the unnatural forces at play. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from within the pack, and Tyler's eyes darted to the center of the circle. There, at the heart of the wolves, was the largest of them all. The Alpha, its eyes glowing with an intensity that seemed to pierce through him, its presence overwhelming. It stood taller than the others, its fur dark and matted with something unidentifiable, its teeth stained red. Tyler felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. The Alpha's gaze held him in place, its eyes hypnotic, like two burning coals drawing him into their depths. "Do you feel it?" The figure's voice echoed again, cutting through the chaos, still as calm and detached as ever. "The Alpha is the one who leads. And now you are part of its pack. You are the one who will lead them into the world of the living. You will hunt. You will tear apart everything in your path." Tyler's heart hammered in his chest as the weight of the figure's words slammed into him. He couldn't breathe. The air felt too thick, like it was closing in on him. The pack was all around him now, their eyes fixed on him with unblinking intensity. They were watching him, waiting for him to make his move, to embrace the role they had chosen for him. And then, something inside him shifted. It was like a switch had been flipped, a switch he hadn't known existed. The terror that had once held him in place began to ebb, replaced by something darker. Something stronger. He felt the anger rise in his chest, bubbling to the surface, his body aching with the sudden surge of power that coursed through him. He could feel the wolves, feel them in his very bones. They were part of him now. And as the Alpha stepped closer, its eyes never leaving him, Tyler knew that he could no longer deny it. He was one of them. The air around him seemed to snap, and he felt his body bend, his senses sharpening as his instincts took over. The darkness, the hunger, it all poured into him, filling him up, consuming him. The Alpha was speaking to him, its voice low and rumbling, but the words didn't need to be spoken aloud. They were in his head now, vibrating through him, syncing with his thoughts. "You are one of us now." The voice was harsh, but there was an undeniable authority in it. "Feel the hunt. Feel the power. This is your path. This is your future." Tyler's body moved on its own accord, as if it were no longer his to control. His hands twitched, his teeth grinding together as his instincts took over, his body transforming in ways he couldn't understand. The pain in his bones, in his very soul, twisted and contorted, but instead of agony, it brought clarity. He could hear the wolves' growls, their breaths, the very pulse of the pack, the rhythm of their hunger. He felt the pull of the pack, the undeniable urge to hunt, to chase, to rip and tear. The desire was irresistible, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. Tyler closed his eyes, trying to suppress the urge, but it was no use. It was too powerful. The hunger was too strong. "Join us, Tyler." The Alpha's voice was soft now, almost coaxing. "You will lead us. You will bring us into the world you once knew. We will make it ours." Tyler's body jerked forward, as if in answer to the Alpha's call. The wolves shifted, their movements in sync, their eyes never leaving him. And with a final, terrifying understanding, Tyler knew the truth. He was no longer human. He had never truly been human. Not anymore. And the world he had once known, his life, his family, his friends, was a distant memory. It was all part of the past now. The pack was his family, and the world he would lead them into was one of destruction and chaos. "No!" Tyler screamed out loud, but it was too late. The wolves closed in, their jaws snapping, their bodies moving with deadly intent. "Yes, Tyler." The figure's voice was soft, almost loving. "This is your destiny. And you cannot escape it." And with that, the darkness closed in around him, swallowing him whole. His world, his humanity, everything he had once been, was lost in the hunger, in the pack's insatiable need. His mind screamed, trying desperately to claw its way back to some semblance of control, but the power of the wolves, their hunger, their call, was all-consuming. His instincts, now fused with theirs, twisted his thoughts, reshaping his very essence. The hunger was not just physical, it gnawed at his soul, urging him forward. The air was thick with the scent of decay, a fetid smell that burned the back of his throat, and the wolves' growls vibrated through him like a wave of static electricity. They were waiting, their eyes gleaming in the dim light, their bodies tense and ready to pounce. Tyler could feel their energy, their need for the hunt. It pulsed in the very air, wrapping itself around him like chains, pulling him deeper into this nightmare. His heart thudded in his chest, matching the rhythm of their growls. He fought it. He tried to fight it. His thoughts were still his own, buried deep beneath the overwhelming rush of adrenaline and primal urges, but they were quickly becoming distant, fragmented. He had to hold on to his humanity, didn't he? Please, he begged, desperate for any shred of himself that remained. But the darkness, the beast within him, was relentless. A low, guttural snarl from the alpha sent a shockwave through the pack, and suddenly, Tyler's legs moved. It wasn't him controlling them. It was the wolves. They were taking over, pushing him further into their world, into their pack. He could feel the transformation taking hold, like his skin was being stretched, pulled, and molded into something monstrous. His senses heightened. His vision sharpened. Every breath, every sound, every heartbeat was louder now, clearer. He could feel the very earth beneath his feet as it pulsed, as if it were alive and breathing with him. You can't fight it forever. The alpha's voice rumbled in his mind, low and insistent. It was more than words now. It was an unspoken bond, a command that coursed through his body like fire. You are one of us now. You have been chosen. Tyler's hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms until they bled, but he couldn't stop himself. His mouth salivated, the taste of blood rising in his throat. The wolves were closing in, moving as one, circling around him with a hunger so deep it made his skin crawl. Tyler had seen them tear apart prey before, had watched in horror as the pack devoured their victims without hesitation. And now, they were waiting for him to join them. Fight it, Tyler. He whispered to himself, barely able to hear the words over the pounding of his own heartbeat. You can't let this happen. But the pack wasn't waiting for him to resist. They were waiting for him to lead them. The figure, the shadowed, haunting presence that had been watching from the outskirts, stepped closer, its form shifting in the smoke. Tyler's head snapped toward it, his mind too clouded to fully understand what was happening. But the figure was always there, always watching. Its eyes were like burning coals, its gaze piercing through Tyler's very being. It's too late to turn back. The figure's voice was calm, detached, as if it were merely stating a fact. You've already crossed the line. The hunt is in your blood now. The pack is your family, and you will lead them into the world of the living. You will make the others pay for what they did to you. The words hit him like a blow to the chest. Tyler wanted to scream, to break free from the suffocating grip of this reality, but the hunger clawing at his insides was too powerful. He could feel the pack's eyes on him, their energy surging through him, binding him to them. The urge to hunt, to kill, was overwhelming. He could hear his heart thundering in his ears as the bloodlust swelled inside him like a rising tide. It's time. The alpha's voice was more commanding now, like the final push before a storm broke. The wolves stepped forward, their paws heavy on the earth, the sound of their movements like a drumbeat that synced with Tyler's pulse. His limbs jerked forward, the force of the pack's command taking hold. His mind screamed, begging for control, but his body wasn't his own anymore. It was them. It was the wolves. With every step he took, every growl that left his throat, he felt himself slip further from the person he had been. His humanity was fading, slipping away like sand through his fingers, until it was nothing but a distant memory, a forgotten echo of who he used to be. The wolves led him, as they always had, into the wilderness. They were closing in on something, on someone. The sound of the wind whistling through the trees, the rustling of leaves, the distant cry of birds, all of it faded into the background. Tyler couldn't hear anything except the wolves' calls, the primal howls that reverberated through his chest. It wasn't just the hunger anymore. It was the need to hunt, to claim, to rip and tear and consume. The world around him blurred into a haze, and all he could see were the wolves. All he could hear was the roar of their hunger. The pack was moving as one, a seamless unit of destruction, and Tyler was their leader. He had no choice but to follow them, to give in to the tide of violence that surged within him. As they approached their prey, anyone, who had the misfortune of crossing their path, Tyler felt a sick satisfaction rise within him. It was no longer fear that gripped him. It was anticipation. But something was off. Something wasn't right. The bloodlust was sharp, but Tyler's mind flickered for a moment. In the haze of his transformation, there was a part of him, a small part, still clinging to the remnants of who he had been. He could feel the presence of the figure again, looming in the shadows, watching. It was pulling at him, pushing him forward, but Tyler felt a strange weight in his chest. The figure had been leading him, pulling him to this moment. But now, as he was on the brink of fully becoming one of them, there was something else. A whisper, a warning hidden beneath the bloodlust. Tyler hesitated just for a moment. A single second of clarity in the middle of the chaos. And then, the first scream shattered the air. The scream echoed through the trees, sharp and desperate, reverberating off the mountainside like a twisted symphony. Tyler's body moved without thought, his legs carrying him with an unnatural speed, the wolves at his side, their growls harmonizing with his own primal instincts. The pack was closing in on their prey, circling like sharks in water, and Tyler, he was at the center of it all. He could feel the power surging through him, the exhilaration of the hunt flooding his veins, making him feel more alive than he ever had before. But as the scream filled the air, something inside of him, something buried deep down, stirred. A flicker of doubt. A voice, small but insistent, tried to claw its way through the fog of his mind. This isn't you. For a moment, Tyler's vision blurred. The shadow of who he had been, who he could have been, hovered at the edge of his consciousness, like a distant memory he couldn't quite reach. He saw the faces of his parents, his friends, the people he had lost when he was just a boy. Their faces were blurred now, distorted by the madness of what he had become. They had never known what would happen to him, never understood the darkness that lived inside him. And then, as quickly as it came, the thought was gone. The pack was too close now. The taste of blood was in the air, and Tyler felt his senses sharpen, the hunger consuming him again, dragging him further into the abyss. He could feel the fear of their prey, someone, a figure huddled in the underbrush, trembling and desperate. The scent of terror, of vulnerability, was intoxicating. He let out a low growl, feeling the vibration in his chest. He could hear the panicked breaths of the person ahead of him. The wolves closed in, and Tyler felt the weight of their eyes, their power. They were all connected now, their minds intertwined in a shared, unspoken hunger. As he stalked forward, Tyler felt his body twitch with anticipation. He could already taste the victory, the satisfaction of the kill. He could hear the voice of the alpha in his mind, guiding him, pushing him, urging him to move faster, to seize control. Take it, Tyler. You were born for this. The alpha's voice was a whisper in his mind, its words dripping with approval, pushing him to embrace the animal he had become. You are the leader now. Let them kill. Tyler's chest tightened, the voice reverberating through him, melding with the growing hunger. The urge to kill was undeniable. It was all he had left. It was all he was now. But just as his hand reached out to grab the struggling figure in the darkness, a sharp sound stopped him. A loud crack, like a twig snapping underfoot. His head snapped up, his eyes darting across the night-darkened woods, searching for the source of the sound. Something wasn't right. The wolves were still circling, still ready to pounce, but Tyler felt an unsettling presence in the air, something that wasn't part of the hunt. A shiver crawled down his spine, and for the first time since he had awakened in this strange, twisted world, he felt the cold fingers of fear creep across his skin. It was then that he saw it. A figure, tall, shadowed, and glowing with an eerie light, emerged from the trees. The glow was unnatural, a sickly greenish hue that illuminated the dark woods like a haunting fire. The figure stood motionless, its presence commanding the very air around it. Tyler could feel the weight of it, could sense the unnatural power that radiated from it, but even more than that, he could sense the danger. The wolves had stopped, their growls low and uncertain, as if they too sensed the shift in the air. The pack was no longer a singular force. They were wary now, hesitant. Tyler felt the connection to them break, just slightly as the figure stepped forward, its form solidifying out of the mist. "What are you doing?" The figure's voice was low, a rumble of authority that vibrated through the air. It wasn't the Alpha's voice. It was something much older, something darker, something more ancient. Tyler's breath caught in his throat, his body suddenly still. His instincts screamed at him to move, to attack, to do what he had been born to do. But his mind, his humanity, rebelled. The figure was unlike anything he had seen. It was as if the very presence of the figure sent a ripple through the world around them, distorting reality itself. The Alpha's voice in his mind fell silent, and Tyler could feel the pack's unease growing. The wolves began to retreat, their glowing eyes flickering between the figure and Tyler. They were no longer sure of who they followed, no longer sure that Tyler was the leader they thought he was. "You should not have come back, boy." The figure's voice grew louder, its words harsh, as though each syllable was a condemnation. "The wolves have claimed you, yes, but you are not meant for them. Not anymore." Tyler's stomach twisted. He had thought he was beyond redemption, thought he had no choice but to embrace the hunt, to become one of them. But now, facing this figure, he wasn't so sure anymore. This wasn't just some spirit of the forest. This was something far older, far more dangerous than anything he had encountered before. The figure stepped forward, its eyes glowing with an unsettling light. Its face was obscured by a hood, but Tyler could sense its gaze, its judgment, falling on him. It was judging him, measuring him, seeing through him. The wolves have no place in this world anymore. They are mere shadows of what they once were. And you, Tyler, are caught in their web. The figure's voice lowered, filled with an ancient sorrow. You are not their leader. You are their victim. And when the time comes, you will pay for the sins that brought you here. Tyler's breath hitched. He didn't want to believe it, but the words rang true in the hollow pit of his stomach. The wolves had claimed him, but what had they claimed him for? What had he truly become? Before he could process it further, the figure raised its hand, a single finger pointing directly at him. Your choice will come soon, Tyler. And when it does, the consequences will be irreversible. You will either lead the pack into their destruction, or you will face your own. Tyler's knees buckled, his mind spinning as the weight of the figure's words crashed into him. The pack circled once again, but the truth was undeniable. He wasn't in control. Not anymore. The wolves' growls became more frantic, more desperate as the figure turned and disappeared into the mist. And Tyler, caught between two worlds, could only watch as the pack, the last part of his former life, continued to retreat. They were leaving him behind as if they, too, knew something he didn't. As the world around him faded into the darkness, Tyler knew he was running out of time. The choice was coming, and it would be the last one he would ever have to make. The wolves circled him again, their growls low, their eyes never leaving him, but he couldn't focus on them anymore. His mind was consumed by the figure's warning. His choice was coming, and he had no idea what that meant. His body was no longer his own, and he could feel the hunger, the primal urge to lead the pack, to hunt. But now there was something else. His mind was split, torn between the world of the living and the world of the wolves. The Alpha's presence had vanished, but Tyler could still feel the weight of its gaze upon him. The wolves were restless now, uncertain, and their unease spread to him like an infection. They were waiting for something, waiting for him to make the decision. The pack, once so unified, was splintering. The wolves were shifting, their movements becoming erratic. They sniffed the air, their heads turning in all directions, and for the first time, Tyler felt uneasy. They were no longer certain, no longer sure that he was the leader they had chosen. The energy between them was off. It was as though they, too, could feel the disturbance in the air, the tension of what was to come. Tyler's chest tightened, the coldness of the reality sinking deeper into his bones. This wasn't just about the wolves anymore. This wasn't just about the hunger, the bloodlust. It was about him. his very essence, his soul, had been changed. He had been marked not just by the wolves, but by something far older, more powerful. He remembered the figure, that figure, the one that had spoken of judgment, of choices. The voice had been so final, so filled with ancient sorrow, as though it knew exactly what Tyler was going to face. It had told him that the wolves were a shadow, a remnant of something that once had been. But Tyler was the future. He was what came next, whether he wanted it or not. He could feel the weight of the pack's eyes on him again, the tension in the air thick and suffocating. The wolves were restless, their bodies tense, but it wasn't just the hunt that they craved now. It was him. They were waiting for him to lead them, to make the final decision that would decide their fate, and his. But Tyler didn't feel like their leader. Not anymore. The pack wasn't his family. They were no longer his kin. They were a part of something much bigger than any of them, something that had claimed him, body and soul. And then, a flash of light, unexpected, blinding, flashed across the dark forest, lighting up the wolves' faces like a fire. Tyler could see them now, their eyes burning with something primal, something ancient. The world around him seemed to bend, the very trees and shadows warping, as if reality itself was being torn apart by an invisible force. Tyler's breath quickened as his body tensed. The truth was settling in. The choice, the power, the control. But before he could process it, the voice of the figure returned. It wasn't distant this time. It was right behind him, its presence almost tangible, as though it were standing just inches away from him. "You are not the hunter, Tyler." The voice was sharp, filled with a weight that made Tyler's bones ache. "You never were." The wolves flinched as if they, too, heard the figure's words. Tyler's body shuddered as the truth of it sank in. He was not in control anymore. The hunger, the instinct to hunt, was no longer his own. He had been led down this path, this fate, by forces much darker than the pack could ever understand. He was a puppet and they were the strings. "You will lead them, yes?" The figure's voice was cold, emotionless. "But not in the way you think. You are not the alpha. Not anymore." Tyler turned quickly, but the figure was gone, lost in the shadows. The wolves shifted uneasily, their glowing eyes still trained on him. He could feel the weight of their gaze, but something had changed. There was no loyalty in their eyes anymore. There was no trust. In that moment, Tyler knew the truth. The wolves hadn't chosen him. He had been chosen by them. But now, they were turning on him. They could sense the shift in the air. They knew, just as he did, that the game was changing. "Known," Tyler whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind and the growling of the pack. "I'm not one of you." He felt his body shake with the force of the realization. The figure had been right. He had been led down this path by forces beyond his control, but he still had a choice that had been taken from him when he had been killed. He had died, torn apart by the wolves, and now he was a part of their world, a part of their curse. "You can't escape it." The voice of the figure echoed in his mind again, a dark reminder that he had no choice. "You've already been marked. You've already crossed the line." The wolves were closing in again, circling him like predators preparing for their prey. But Tyler could feel the weight of his choices now, the weight of his humanity, or what was left of it, crushing down on him. The pack was no longer his family. They were the ghosts of his past, the ghosts of what he had once been. And now, they had turned on him, and there was no way out. As Tyler faced the wolves, his mind was a blur of fear, doubt, and confusion. The figure's warning echoed in his ears, and the cold realization of his fate settled in. There was no way to stop it now. There was no way to turn back. He had already been marked. And when the time came, he would lead the pack, or he would perish along with them. The wolves were closing in, their growls growing louder, more erratic as Tyler's body froze in place. His heart raced, his mind screaming for him to move, to do something, anything, but it was as though his body was no longer his to control. His limbs trembled, his chest tightened with every breath. The pack surrounded him, their eyes glowing with an unnatural intensity, their mouths open, dripping with saliva. They were hungry. But for him? Tyler's pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out everything but the sounds of the wolves' snarls and the distant howls that seemed to echo through the very earth itself. You are not the Alpha." Tyler shook his head, as if trying to shake the words out of his brain. But no matter how much he wanted to deny it, the truth was undeniable. He wasn't the leader. Not anymore. He was their prey. And that realization, more terrifying than anything he had experienced in his life, hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. He wasn't in control. He had never been in control. The pack shifted, their growls growing louder as they closed in on him. Tyler felt his body move of its own accord, as if it were no longer responding to his commands. His feet took steps toward the Alpha, his eyes locked with its gleaming yellow ones. The hunger was building within him, but it was no longer his hunger. It wasn't his choice anymore. It was theirs. A twisted sensation crawled up his spine, and suddenly, the world around him seemed to collapse inward. The forest, the wolves, everything was closing in on him, and he couldn't breathe. The cold wind whipped through the trees, biting at his exposed skin. And yet, despite the biting cold, his body felt like it was on fire. The figure, that strange, shadowed entity, was back. He could feel its presence like a suffocating weight, and he knew it was watching him, waiting. It had been there the whole time, lurking in the shadows, guiding him down this path, leading him toward this inevitable moment. "You cannot escape it," the voice whispered through the fog, like an echo in his mind. "The wolves are not your family. They are your punishment. You are trapped here, Tyler. Forever." Tyler's chest tightened. His breath came in sharp gasps as he stumbled backward, his hands reaching out, grasping at the air, desperate for something, anything, to hold on to. But there was nothing. Just the wolves, closing in, the pack ready to descend on him. The hunger was unbearable. It was like a fire consuming him from the inside, filling him with an unquenchable need that he couldn't control. He wanted to scream, to fight, to break free from this nightmare, but the pack's energy, its power, was too overwhelming. The wolves were not just a force of nature anymore. They were something darker. They were the darkness. And Tyler had been marked. The pack was a manifestation of something much older than he could comprehend, something that had claimed him long before he had understood what was happening. "You have no control here." The voice of the figure was louder now, its presence filling every inch of Tyler's mind. "You have crossed the line, boy. The wolves are not your family. They never were. They were always your punishment." Tyler's stomach twisted in agony, the words hitting him like a blow to the gut. His mind screamed in protest, but his body betrayed him. The hunger gnawed at his insides, overwhelming every thought, every shred of humanity he had left. There was no escaping it. There was no going back. The wolves closed in. The Alpha stepped forward, its massive form looming over him, its glowing eyes locked on Tyler's. The pack was quiet now, waiting for him to make the final choice, to submit, to lead, or to die. "You will lead them." The figure's voice cut through the air like a whip, its words final, unwavering. "You will take your place in the pack, Tyler. The world of the living will be yours to destroy. The wolves will follow you, and when the time comes, the hunt will begin." The Alpha's growl resonated deep within Tyler's chest. It wasn't a simple warning. It was an order. He could feel it now, deep within him. The pull to become one with the pack, to embrace the darkness that had consumed him. His body moved on its own, his hands reaching out toward the Alpha, as if in some kind of unspoken agreement. But as his fingers brushed against the wolf's fur, something snapped inside him. A single, fleeting moment of clarity. A moment where the fog in his mind cleared, and the truth hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a pack. This wasn't family. This wasn't redemption. The wolves were not his family. They were the embodiment of his damnation. And the truth shattered him. Tyler's body shook violently, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. He fought the pull, but it was no use. The hunger was too strong. His hands clenched, his body tensed with the urge to hunt, to kill. But deep within him, beneath the layer of darkness, he could still hear his own voice, faint, but persistent. No, the pack's growl stopped. The figure's voice, too, faded for a moment, as if it were waiting for something. Tyler took a step back, his hands trembling at his sides, the wolves watching him, their eyes burning with hunger and expectation. For the first time, Tyler felt the full weight of his actions. The choices he had made, the people he had left behind, the life he had abandoned in pursuit of something far darker. You were given a chance, Tyler. The figure's voice returned, softer now, almost mournful. But you chose the pack. You chose the hunt. And now, there is no way out. Tyler's chest tightened as he realized the full extent of the figure's words. There was no redemption here. There was no turning back. He was a part of the pack now, part of something far darker than he could have ever imagined. And as the pack closed in, ready to begin the hunt once again, Tyler understood that he was not their leader. He was their vessel. The hunt was only just beginning, and it would never end. Tyler felt the ground beneath him shift, as if the very earth itself were responding to the wolf's hunger, to his fate. The pack closed in around him, their glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. Every breath he took filled his lungs with the sharp, metallic scent of blood, the air thick with the scent of his impending destruction. He wasn't in control anymore. His body, once his own, now belonged to the pack. The hunger was overwhelming, and though he tried to fight it, every part of him, a part that still clung to his humanity, was consumed by the desire to follow them, to hunt with them. He could feel their energy inside him, the dark bond that connected him to them, pulling him deeper into the abyss. The Alpha stepped forward, its eyes glowing with an unearthly intensity, its gaze fixed on Tyler. There was no kindness in its eyes, only the cold, merciless hunger that had driven them all. Tyler's legs moved of their own accord, bringing him closer to the beast, closer to his fate. He could no longer deny it. You are one of us now. The figure's voice echoed in his mind, filled with finality. There is no escape. There is only the hunt. Tyler tried to look away, to resist, but his mind was slipping away, fading into the shadows with each passing second. He could feel the pack's power growing stronger, the pull of the Alpha's gaze growing more powerful with each beat of his heart. The wolves circled him, their growls vibrating through the air, filling the silence with their hunger. And as they closed in, Tyler understood the horrible truth. There would be no redemption, no salvation. He was forever marked, forever one of them. The last vestiges of his humanity, the boy who had once been alive, full of hope, full of possibility, were slipping through his fingers, replaced by something darker, something primal. He had become nothing more than a vessel for the wolves' insatiable hunger. And there was no escape. As the wolves lunged forward, Tyler's scream was drowned out by their growls. His body was torn apart, not by fangs and claws, but by the weight of the fate that had been sealed long ago. The hunt had only just begun.